The cold was a physical thing on the main street of Redemption, Nevada. It did not arrive the way cold comes to gentler places, with a polite chill that sends folks reaching for a heavier coat. No, in that high desert country, the cold descended like a verdict, sudden and absolute, and it sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the road with the kind of determination that suggested it had no intention of letting go until spring. It clung to the clapboard siding of every building along the main drag, leaving behind a coat of brittle frost that caught the thin winter light and threw it back in dull, reluctant flashes. The wooden signs above the storefronts groaned against their iron brackets. The water trough outside the livery stable had long since turned to a solid block of gray ice. Even the dogs, the ones that usually lounged in every patch of available sun, had retreated to wherever dogs go when the world turns against them. It was the kind of cold that made a man's breath hang in the air like the ghost of a word he wished he'd never spoken. Every exhale was a confession, visible and brief, gone before you could take it back. The kind of cold that got down into the marrow and stayed there, that made the simple act of walking across a street feel like a negotiation with the elements. Men ducked their chins into their collars. Women held their shawls across their mouths with mittened hands. The town moved faster than usual, not with energy, but with the grim efficiency of people who understood that stopping meant freezing. On a wooden bench outside the bakery, where the faint and cruel smell of yeast drifted out from under the door like a taunt, the cold had found its most willing and most helpless victims. Two girls, barely women, sat huddled together with the desperate closeness of people who have nothing left but each other. They were twins, identical even in their shared misery, their faces pale as river ice and streaked with the dried tracks of silent tears they had perhaps stopped bothering to wipe away hours ago. Their dark hair hung loose around their faces, offering no real warmth, only the illusion of shelter. They were barefoot. That was the detail that struck anyone who happened to look, truly look, and not merely glance and keep walking. Their feet were tucked beneath the hems of their dresses, a small and futile gesture against the hard, frozen earth beneath the bench. The wood of the bench itself was rimmed with frost, and the cold came up through it and through their thin clothes without apology. Their garments, the pale gray silk of traditional cheongsams, were tattered and stained in ways that spoke of long miles and hard weather. These were clothes made for a different world entirely, for tea-houses and lamplight and the warmth of a family home, not for the punishing winters of the Nevada high desert. On their bodies now, those garments were little more than rags dressed up in the memory of elegance. For 5 days since the very last of their family's charity had run through their fingers like sand, this bench had been their home. 5 days of watching the town move around them. 5 days of the gnawing hunger in their bellies that had long since moved past sharp and settled into something duller and more permanent. A low ache that colored every thought and made the smell from the bakery a particular kind of torture. They had learned to ration their remaining strength the way starving people learn to ration everything, carefully, without waste, moving as little as possible. Even their grief had been rationed. They had cried themselves dry on the first day. After that, there was nothing left but endurance. Men and women passed them on that bench all day long, pulling their coats tighter, looking at the frozen mud ahead of their own boots. Occasionally, someone would glance, and you could see in their expression the brief, complicated arithmetic of a person who sees suffering and must decide what to do with it. Pity was there, certainly. But pity alone doesn't warm a person or fill a belly. And alongside the pity was something less comfortable, a deep, unsettling unease that came from the particular combination of circumstances these two girls represented. They were foreign, alone, and destitute. Those three things together in a small western town in the winter of 1879 made decent folk feel the most helpless, and helplessness so often curdles into avoidance. It was easier to walk faster and tell yourself someone else would handle it. Then a shadow fell across them, and it was a different kind of shadow. Not the fleeting shade of a cloud moving across the pale sun, but the solid, deliberate shape of a man who had stopped. He stood a few feet away, not so close as to crowd them, but close enough that his stopping was a statement of intent. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a sheepskin coat that had seen hard use but was still doing its job. His face was weathered in the way that faces get in country like this, not old, but carrying the accumulated weight of years spent outdoors, of seasons endured, of grief that had settled into the lines around his eyes and stayed. His hat was pulled low against the wind, but the eyes beneath the brim were clear and gray and steady, and they held nothing cruel in them. No judgment. No contempt. Only a quiet, searching attention that moved slowly from one girl's face to the other, and then down to their bare feet, and back up again. He had seen suffering before. He had known it in his own bones, carried it the way you carry a stone in your boot, always aware of it with every step. He stood there for a long moment, and simply looked, which was already more than most people on that street had bothered to do. Then he cleared his throat, the sound rough as gravel in the quiet cold air. "You can't stay here," he said. The words were not unkind. They were not delivered with any pleasure or authority. They were simply the truth, stated with the plainness of a man who had learned that prettying up hard truths didn't make them any less hard. One of the sisters, the one who held herself a fraction straighter even in exhaustion, lifted her head. Her eyes were dark and hollow with fatigue, but there was something alive in them still, a flicker of defiance that had survived everything else falling away. Her name was Lynn, though the man didn't know that yet. "We have nowhere to go," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse and dehydration, the English words formed with careful precision, as if each one cost her something. The man nodded slowly, his gaze moving to her sister, who kept her head bowed, her black hair curtaining her face. Sue, the more frightened of the two, or perhaps simply the more honest about her fear. He looked back at Lynn. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." He took a measured half-step closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "My name is Jacob. I have a ranch about a day's ride from here. It's not much to look at, but it's warm. And there's food." Lynn's eyes narrowed just slightly. In their short and brutal life, they had assembled a thorough education in what things cost when a man offered them freely. They had learned this lesson most recently, and most painfully from a man in San Francisco whose offer of help had turned out to be a claim of ownership. "What do you want from us?" she asked, and the question came out sharp and clear as broken glass, because she needed it to. Jacob's gaze did not waver. He looked at their hands clasped together between them, white at the knuckles. He looked at their frames, which were bird-like and fragile in a way that comes from a body beginning to consume itself. He had made his decision before he had even spoken, maybe before he had even crossed the street. He was a man who acted on necessities when he recognized them. "I need help," he said. The words were simple, and he meant them to be. "The work is hard. I can't pay you in coin, not right now. But I can give you a roof over your heads and a share of what we have. Food on the table. A warm place to sleep. A place to be." He paused, letting the offer settle in the frozen air between them, giving it time to be weighed against the alternative they were currently living. "It's better than freezing to death on this bench." He looked up at the sky then, which had been threatening all morning and was now beginning to deliver on its promise, spitting small, hard pellets of snow that ticked against the frozen boards and stung any exposed skin they found. "Storm's coming in for real. You need to decide now. Come with me or don't." He looked back at them with a patience that had nothing soft about it. "Your choice." Lynn looked at her sister. Sue finally raised her head from under the curtain of her hair. Her face was a perfect, heartbreaking mirror of her twins, the same dark eyes, the same high cheekbones now sharpened by hunger, the same mouth. But where Lynn's expression was guarded and calculating, Sue's was simply afraid. Afraid and exhausted, and at the very end of something. As she met her sister's eyes, she gave a small nod. It was barely perceptible. It was everything. It was not a choice made from hope. It was a choice made from the absolute absence of anything else. Lynn turned back to Jacob. Her chin came up, a small act of pride that cost her nothing and meant everything. "We will go," she said. Jacob simply nodded. "All right then." He turned and walked toward a freight wagon hitched a little way down the street, loaded with sacks of flour and supplies against the storm. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He knew they would be. There was no other direction left for them in the world. He helped them both onto the wagon seat and wrapped them in a thick wool blanket from his bedroll, the kind of blanket that smells of horses and cold pine and long nights under open sky. A smell completely foreign to them, but not unpleasant. He did not try to make conversation as he climbed up and took the reins. Words, Lynn thought, felt like a luxury they hadn't earned yet. She was grateful for the silence as the horses pulled them out of Redemption and into the white expanse beyond. The town dissolved behind them and the land opened up into a rolling wilderness of gray hills and skeletal sagebrush, all of it rapidly disappearing under the advancing snow. The storm meant business. It came sideways on a hard wind, driving and horizontal, and within the first hour, the road ahead was indistinguishable from the country on either side of it. Only Jacob seemed to know which way was which, following some internal map that the landscape had written into him over years. Sue pressed herself against Lynn, trembling in long, continuous waves, not just from the cold now but from the sheer terrifying scale of the emptiness around them. Lynn wrapped both arms around her sister and looked straight ahead and did not let herself think too far forward. It was long after dark when Jacob finally eased the horses to a halt. Through the swirling curtain of snow, Lynn could make out the dark shapes of two structures hunkered in the shelter of a low ridge, a cabin and a barn, the cabin showing one weak yellow square of window light like a single eye keeping watch. She had never been so glad to see a building in her life. Jacob lifted Sue down from the wagon as if she weighed nothing, which she nearly did, and set her on the sheltered porch. He did the same for Lynn, and for one unsteady moment her legs refused to cooperate, numb and useless from the cold and the hours of sitting. He steadied her with a firm hand under her arm, impersonal and practical as a man steadying a fence post. "Inside," he said, already turning back to the horses. "There's a fire in the stove." The cabin was a single room. It was brutally simple. A cast-iron stove in one corner that radiated a heat so blessed and immediate that both girls stood before it for a full minute without speaking, just letting it happen. A rough-hewn table with two chairs. A single cot against one wall, neatly made. A larger built-in bunk against the other. A few shelves with tin plates and cups, a small stack of books, and a folded square of cloth that might have been embroidery. The floor was swept clean. The place was profoundly orderly in the way that places are when one person alone must impose order on the world or go mad from the silence. Sue went directly to the stove, palms out, shoulders gradually unknotting. Lynn stood in the center of the room and looked at everything and thought, this is what salvation looks like. Not beautiful. Not comfortable. But solid. Real. Hers for now. Jacob came in stamping snow from his boots, shook his coat, and without a word went to the cupboard and produced a block of salt pork and a measure of dried beans. He cooked without ceremony, his hands moving with the efficiency of long practice and solitude. The smell of the pork hitting the hot pan was something close to unbearable. Lynn's stomach tightened with a hunger so sharp and immediate it was almost a sound. When Jacob set the tin bowls on the table and stepped back, either sister hesitated or waited for invitation. They ate the way starving people eat, bent over their bowls, completely without self-consciousness, forgetting everything that wasn't the food. Jacob sat across from them and ate his own portions slowly and watched them with something that was not pity and not quite curiosity, something in between. When they were finished he took their bowls without comment. "There's a loft," he said, nodding at a ladder in the corner. "Extra blankets up there. It's the warmest spot in the house." He took his coat from its peg. "I have to see to the stock." And then he was back out into the storm, as if solitude were his natural element, and the cabin were just a place he sometimes passed through. Lynn and Sue climbed the ladder to the small, low loft. There were blankets as promised, thick wool ones piled on rough floorboards, and from up here they could see the whole of the cabin below laid out like a map. As she settled herself under the blankets, and felt warmth beginning slowly to reclaim her body, Lynn noticed something. Climbing, she had caught a brief glimpse inside the trunk at the foot of the bunk below. Tucked among the spare clothes was a child's drawing, folded small and handled soft with age. She looked away immediately, the way you look away from something private and sacred. But it stayed with her. The storm raged for 2 full days. There were 3 strangers in a small space with no shared language of comfort, only the language of necessary work and careful distance. Jacob moved with a quiet, restless energy, mending harnesses at the table, sharpening tools, his hands always occupied. He spoke when there was something to say and went silent again the moment it was said. Lynn and Sue stayed out of his way, retreating to the loft or sitting quietly on the bench along the wall, learning the rhythms of him. The sound of his boots on the floorboards. The way he paused by the window sometimes and looked out at the white nothing with a face that showed nothing but held everything. On the 3rd morning the sky opened up brilliant and merciless blue. The world lay buried under a clean white silence. Jacob announced at breakfast that some of the herd would have sheltered in the canyons but others would be trapped in the drifts, and that he had to go find them. Lynn stood up before he'd finished the sentence. "We will help." He looked at them both, taking in their slight frames and their hands that had never pulled a calf from a snowdrift or dug through 4 feet of packed white to find a panicked, buried animal. He was about to refuse. But then he saw the look in Lynn's eyes, and he recognized it. It was not desperation. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. They were not here to be sheltered like fragile things. They were here to work, and they intended to make good on that. "All right," he said slowly. "You do exactly what I say out there. This country doesn't give second chances when you make mistakes in the cold." He found clothes for them in the trunk, men's clothes worn soft with long use, and boots that had belonged to someone smaller than him. The clothes hung on their frames but they were warm, and warmth was the only currency that mattered that morning. Lynn pulled on a pair of thick socks and caught another glimpse of the folded drawing in the trunk, and felt again that she had stepped close to something sacred without meaning to. The work was harder than anything they could have imagined. They spent the day struggling through drifts that sometimes came to their waists, following Jacob as he tracked the scattered cattle by signs that were invisible to them at first. A disturbance in the snow here, a faint breath steam rising there. He showed them what to look for. He showed them how to dig. He showed them how to get a half-frozen animal to its feet and moving again toward warmth. He was not a patient man in the way that gentle men are patient, but he was patient in the way that competent men are, steady and clear and willing to repeat himself without irritation. By late afternoon they were driving a small group of shivering cattle back toward the barn when they saw the rider on the ridge. She was a woman, sitting a fine-looking mare with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding whatever horse and landscape she happened to occupy. Her coat was expensive, fur-trimmed, and she wore it like authority. She watched them from the high ground for a long moment before urging her horse down the slope. "That's Martha Vance," Jacob said, and something in his voice went flat and careful. "Biggest spread in the valley. She believes that entitles her to a say in everything else that happens in it." Martha Vance pulled her horse up a few feet away. She was in her 50s, with a face that had spent decades getting exactly what it wanted and had sharpened itself accordingly. Her eyes moved over Lynn and Sue with the swift, dismissive efficiency of a woman cataloging things she considers beneath her, then settled on Jacob. "Jacob," she said, with a warmth that was entirely manufactured, "I see you've acquired some new help." "They're earning their keep," Jacob replied level. "Are they now?" She smiled. "Funny thing. Talk in town is that you picked up a pair of strays. Chinese strays at that. People are wondering what a man would want, living all alone out here, bringing in girls like these." She left the insinuation sitting in the cold air like something she'd dropped, and didn't intend to pick back up. Lynn felt the heat of shame and fury move up into her face. Sue shrank back a half step, trying to make herself smaller. Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between Martha and the girls with a naturalness that suggested he hadn't consciously decided to do it. "What happens on my property is my business, Martha. These girls are under my protection. Now, unless you've got cattle on my land, I'd suggest you head back to yours before dark." Martha Vance had expected shame. She had expected the flustered, apologetic retreat of a man caught at something. She was not accustomed to simple, quiet refusal, and it made her furious. She looked past Jacob at Lynn, and what was in her eyes was not curiosity, and not even real malice, only the cold contempt of a person who has decided that certain other people do not count. "This is a decent, God-fearing valley," she said. "People won't stand for impropriety." She wheeled her horse and rode away, rigid-backed, a woman receding from a battle she had expected to win easily and had not. But Lynn knew with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach that it was not over. Martha Vance had put them on display, had made them the subject of talk that would follow them everywhere they went in that valley. Whatever fragile, ordinary life had been beginning to take shape was now something else. That night the silence in the cabin was different. Not the peaceful silence of shared weariness, but the heavy silence of unspoken things pressing against the walls. Jacob sat at the table and stared at the fire for a long time after supper. Finally he said, without turning, "She won't let it go. Martha likes things tidy. She doesn't tolerate loose ends." A pause. "And right now, that's what you are to her." Lynn set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the tin plates. She came and stood near the stove, and she asked the question she had been holding in her chest since the bench in town. "Why did you help us? You did not know us. You owed us nothing." Jacob was quiet for a long time, his finger tracing the wood grain of the table as though reading something written there. Then he said, his voice low and rough-edged, that he had a family once. A wife named Sarah, and a little girl. The fever had come through 2 years ago, the way it comes through isolated places, fast and indiscriminate, and it had taken them both in the same week. He had buried them on a hill east of the ranch. He had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning them, and because he did not know where else in the world he belonged. Sarah was from the city, he said. She hated the quiet out here. Said it was too loud. I didn't understand that until she was gone. He looked up then, and for the first time Lynn saw past the weathered surface of him to the deep hollow ache beneath, the kind of grief that doesn't diminish so much as it becomes part of the architecture of a person. I saw you two on that bench, and I saw people who had nothing. And I had too much nothing of my own. I thought maybe we could make a different kind of silence. Something better. The words settled into the room and Lynn felt something shift in her chest, some locked thing loosening. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed trousers and brought out a small flat object wrapped in a piece of silk she had guarded through everything. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a piece of pale green jade carved in the shape of a butterfly, broken at one wing, the missing piece lost somewhere in the long trail of their flight. She told him then. All of it. Her father, a scholar who loved books more than commerce. The bad debt to a man from a trading company named Fong. The influenza that had taken both parents in the same month. Fong arriving afterward with his contracts and his cold arithmetic, claiming their father's debt had transferred to them, stripping the house of everything worth taking and pronouncing the debts still unpaid. Their uncle pressing his last coins into their hands and putting them on a train and telling them to go east and disappear, to go far enough that Fong would not spend money chasing them. The money ran out in redemption, Lynn said simply. She looked down at the broken jade in her palm. This is all that is left of our home. Sue had come down the ladder while her sister spoke and stood beside her now, hand in hand. Jacob looked at them for a long time, and whatever he had seen in them before, this was different. He saw now not strays or charity cases or even hired help, but 2 young women who had fought a war of their own and were still fighting it. The shadow of Martha Vance seemed very small and manageable compared to the shadow of Fong. And Jacob understood, with the kind of certainty that lives in a man's gut rather than his head, that the danger was not over. It had followed them here, patient and methodical. And when it arrived, it would not come with cold looks and pointed words. It would come with legal paper and official backing and the full authority of money to bend the law whichever way served it. He would need to be ready. A week passed. The snow melted under a relentless high desert sun, turning the valley into a muddy mess that was slow-going but passable. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one built out of shared necessity and the gradual, careful growth of mutual understanding. Lynn and Sue worked hard, and they were quick. Sue, who had seemed so fragile on that bench and so terrified through the storm, turned out to have a rare and quiet gift with animals. She moved among the horses and cattle without sudden gestures, speaking softly in a mixture of English and Chinese that the animals appeared to find equally soothing. Nervous horses steadied under her hands. A sick calf that Jacob had half given up on recovered under her patient attention. Lynn turned her mind to the household and the accounts. With the careful ingenuity of someone who had always had to make things stretch, she reorganized their food stores and found economies Jacob hadn't considered. She began keeping a written record of their small transactions, what came in, what went out, what they owed to the general store in town, what they might expect from the sale of milk and cheese in the spring market. The cabin, which had been an occupied space, gradually became something closer to a home. Jacob found himself smiling at the supper table. Not often, and not widely, but it happened. It was on a bright afternoon when Jacob was deep in the barn working on a broken axle that he heard a buggy coming up the road from town. He came to the barn door and knew immediately it was not anyone local. The hired rig, the black suit, the face that was smooth and unreadable in the particular way of men who make their living in transactions. Lynn appeared in the cabin doorway with a dish towel in her hands and a stillness in her face that Jacob had not seen since those first cold days, the particular stillness of controlled fear. The man climbed down and smiled with his mouth only. He was looking, he said pleasantly, for two young women, sisters, who had come east from San Francisco. He looked at Lynn directly. Her uncle, he added, was a fool to have thought distance could retire a debt owed to Mr. Fong. Jacob came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag and put himself between the man and the cabin without haste, as though he were simply walking somewhere that happened to be in the way. The man explained himself with the patience of someone holding better cards. The girls were collateral against a contracted debt held by the Golden Dragon Trading Company. The contract was legal. He had documentation. He patted his breast pocket. He could take them now, peacefully, or he could return with a territorial marshal and a signed warrant, and Jacob could explain to the judge what business he had harboring the property of a creditor. The word property landed in the yard like a dropped stone. Jacob said very quietly that this was Nevada and that people were not property. The man laughed, brief and unpleasant, and said that everything was property if the paperwork was in order, and that Jacob might want to think carefully about obstruction before his next trip to town. He would return in 3 days with the law. Jacob should have the girls ready. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never lost a fight conducted on paper. The moment he was gone, Sue broke into quiet sobs. Lynn held her, her own hands not entirely steady. Jacob stood in the muddy yard and watched the buggy disappear and did his arithmetic. 3 days. A legal contract in a territory hungry for the investment and goodwill of San Francisco business interests. A judge who would likely be sympathetic. No counterclaim, no legal standing, no money for a lawyer. He went inside and took the territorial law book from the shelf and put it on the table. "We're not running," he said. For 2 days the cabin was a different kind of place. Lynn and Jacob went through the law book page by page, looking for anything that might serve as a foothold, a challenge to the contract's validity, a legal argument that could buy them time if nothing else. Sue, who had been quietly watching, took a sheet of paper and an abacus and began working through the figures of the debt that Lynn remembered, the original sum their father had borrowed, the interest Fong had claimed, the fees and penalties and compounding calculations. Her fingers moved fast and certain on the abacus. After an hour she set it down and showed Lynn what she had found. The numbers did not add up. They did not come close to adding up. The debt, as Fong had stated it, was mathematically impossible given the original principal and any reasonable accounting of elapsed time. It was not a debt. It was a fabrication wearing a debt's clothes. It was thin. It was not nothing. On the second night Jacob rode into redemption alone. He did not go to the saloon or the general store. He went to the telegraph office and composed a message to a name he had not used in years, a contact from a chapter of his life he never discussed, someone who had reason to know the business dealings of certain San Francisco trading companies. He sent the message and rode home under a starless sky, not knowing whether it would be answered, not knowing what he would do if it wasn't. The third day came in cold and clear. They were all three quiet at breakfast, eating without much appetite, listening to the ordinary sounds of the ranch in the morning wind. Around midday they heard horses on the road. 2 buggies came down from the ridge. The first held Fong, satisfied and unhurried. The second held Marshal Bates, a grim-faced lawman with a silver star and the uncomfortable expression of a man executing a duty he has complicated feelings about, and beside him, unavoidable, Martha Vance, sitting straight-backed with the vindicated look of someone who has waited long enough for the world to arrange itself correctly. They pulled up in the yard. Bates dismounted and recited the terms of the warrant in the flat voice of official business. Jacob heard him out. He looked past Bates at Fong, whose confidence sat on him like an expensive coat. From the porch, Lynn said clearly, so that everyone in the yard could hear her, that they were not property. Martha Vance said something sharp and dismissive. Then they all heard a horse coming fast from the direction of town, ridden harder than the road recommended. The telegraph boy skidded his horse to a stop in the muddy yard, breathing hard, waving a slip of paper. Jacob read it once, and then read it again. A slow, grim smile moved across his face. He held the paper out to Bates. The marshal read it aloud. The words came out unevenly, his voice losing its official certainty as he went. The Golden Dragon Trading Company had been dissolved in 1878 following a fraud investigation. Its assets had been seized. Its principal, Wang Chung Fong, was wanted for questioning by the United States Marshal's Office in San Francisco. The yard went very quiet. Fong's color had gone the gray of ash. The smirk was gone, and in its place was the wide, bright-eyed expression of a man who has just heard the trap close. He called it a forgery. A trick. His voice had lost its pleasant steadiness, and was climbing in pitch. Jacob said softly that the telegraph was a remarkable technology. It traveled considerably faster than a lie. Marshal Bates looked at the paper. Looked at Fong. Made the calculation that lawmen sometimes have to make when 2 sets of legal obligation point in opposite directions. His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol and his voice went official and cold. He told Fong he'd be coming along to answer some questions. Fong tried to back toward his buggy. The 2 deputies who had been sitting their horses in quiet observation stepped forward and took him by the arms. Martha Vance watched all of this from her buggy seat with an expression that went through several stages: disbelief, fury, and finally something almost like calculation, the face of a woman reassessing a situation and deciding the wisest course was distance. She turned her buggy without a word and drove back up the ridge road at a pace that suggested she wished to have nothing whatever to do with any of this. Bates, before he left, stopped in front of Jacob. He looked at the cabin, at the law book visible through the open door, at Lynn and Sue on the porch. He tipped his hat. Said it looked like Jacob had it handled. He rode after his deputies and his prisoner and left the yard to the 3 of them and the sound of the wind. The spring that came after was a season of quiet and purposeful rebuilding. The shadow that had followed Lynn and Sue from San Francisco was gone, and the space it left behind was not empty but clean, like a room after you have thrown out everything that didn't belong. The ranch began to change shape. Sue planted a garden in a patch of earth she tilled herself and coaxed into life a variety of vegetables that had no business growing in that soil, and yet grew. Lynn's careful accounting turned their small dairy operation into something that paid, selling in town where their reputation had quietly shifted from strays and objects of scandal to capable homesteaders who had bested a San Francisco fraudster and kept their ground. Jacob built a new room onto the cabin that spring, and then another. He replaced the rough bench on the porch with a smooth, wide swing, large enough for 3, built from good pine and set on chains that sang slightly in the evening wind. One evening in late summer they sat on that swing together, watching the sun set the western hills on fire with color that never looked the same 2 nights in a row. The air was warm and carried the smell of sage and coming rain, and the particular peace of a day's work behind them. Jacob looked at Lynn in the fading light and thought about the girl on the bench in town, the fierce and terrified and unbowed girl with her bare feet and her chin held up. He thought about the broken jade butterfly she had shown him in this very cabin on a cold winter night. He thought about how things broke sometimes and ended up becoming something different and perhaps stronger in the breaking. They were not 3 strangers held together by desperation anymore. They were something that didn't have a simple name, built out of hard weather and shared danger and the particular kind of trust that grows only in places where trust has been genuinely tested. It wasn't the family any of them had started with. It was the family that the winter and the work and the long strange mercy of circumstance had assembled from what was left. They had faced down the cold and the hunger and a man who dealt in human debts and a town's ready judgment, and they had built something out of the far side of all that. It wasn't grand. It was a small ranch on a ridge in Nevada with a garden and a new room and a porch swing built for 3. It was a home. And on an evening like this one, with the hills burning gold and the sage smelling sweet and the chains singing their quiet song, that was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, everything.